When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini took control of Iran, executions became one of the most powerful tools used to reshape the country. What started as quick revenge against top officials soon turned into a highly organized system of killing, using methods like firing squads and hanging to eliminate anyone seen as a threat. It started right after the revolution reached its peak in February 1979. There was no transition period, no slow handover of power, and no effort to rebuild a normal legal system first. Under the authority of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the new leadership moved straight into action, and executions became one of the first tools used to secure control. When Khomeini returned to Tehran on February 1st after years in exile in Iraq and later France, he didn't come back to negotiate or share power. Within days, revolutionary forces began arresting people connected to the previous government of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, focusing especially on those who had held power in the military, intelligence services like Savak, and senior police roles. These arrests happened fast and often without formal warrants. People were taken from homes, offices, or even off the streets and moved into temporary detention centers or prisons. Inside these places, revolutionary courts were set up almost immediately. These courts weren't like normal courts with detailed procedures. They were designed for speed. Judges like Sadek Alkali became central figures in this system, gaining a reputation for handing down death sentences within hours. Trials were often extremely short, sometimes lasting less than an hour, and focused on broad accusations like corruption, loyalty to the Shah, or acting against the revolution. There was usually no proper defense, no time to gather evidence, and no real chance for the accused to explain themselves fully. Once the decision was made, the next step happened immediately. One of the clearest early examples came on February 15, 1979, when 4 high-ranking generals were executed on the roof of a school in Tehran. Among them was Reza Naji, along with other senior military figures who had served under the Shah. They were taken through a rapid trial and then moved straight to the execution site. Within hours of being sentenced, they were lined up and shot by firing squad. The location itself, a school rooftop, showed how improvised the system still was at that point. There was no need for a formal execution ground. Any space could be turned into one. Firing squads became the main method in these early days because they were simple and could be carried out almost anywhere without preparation. Prison courtyards, rooftops, and open areas were all used. Prisoners were often still wearing the same clothes they had on when they were arrested. They were lined up against walls or barriers, and a group of armed men fired at close range. The process was direct and left no room for delay. Many executions happened on the same day as sentencing, sometimes just hours later, which meant there was no time for appeals, outside attention, or intervention. Families were often completely unaware of what was happening. In many cases, they didn't even know their relative had been arrested before hearing that they'd already been executed. This added another layer of shock, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. The speed of these actions wasn't only about removing enemies quickly. It was about creating a sense that the new system was absolute and immediate, and that once someone was targeted, there was no way back. Bodies were sometimes photographed and shown in newspapers or on state-controlled television. In some cases, they were left visible for a short time before being taken away. These images were not hidden. They were part of the message. The goal was to show that the old system was not just defeated. It was being wiped out completely and publicly. Anyone who had been connected to it could see what had happened to others in similar positions. This approach spread fear very quickly, especially among those who had even a small link to the previous government. It created a situation where people didn't need to be warned. They could see the consequences directly. As 1979 turned into 1980 and then 1981, executions by firing squad didn't just continue under Ruhollah Khomeini. They were turned into a structured system that could run daily without slowing down. What started as rushed, chaotic killings right after the revolution quickly became organized inside prisons like Evin in Tehran, and Qasr prison, which had already been used during the Shah's time, but were now fully controlled by revolutionary authorities. The revolutionary courts, influenced early on by judges like Sadek Kalkali, kept sending a constant flow of prisoners into these facilities, and the execution process had to keep up with that volume. Inside these prisons, specific locations were fixed for executions, so the process didn't need to be set up again and again. Guards knew exactly where to take prisoners, shooters knew exactly where to stand, and officials knew when each step would happen. It became routine. Prisoners were usually taken out late at night or just before sunrise, times when the prison was quieter and movement could be controlled more easily. Many were blindfolded before leaving their cells, not just to stop them from seeing, but also to disorient them and prevent any resistance or communication with others. Once they reached the execution area, prisoners were positioned quickly. Some were placed standing against a wall, while others were forced to kneel, depending on the space and the setup. The shooters, often members of the Revolutionary Guard or other loyal forces, stood at a fixed distance and aimed directly at the chest to hit the heart and lungs. The intention was to end life instantly, but in reality, that didn't always happen. There were many cases where the first round of bullets didn't kill immediately. In those moments, a final close-range shot was used to finish the execution. This step became so common that it was treated as part of the process, not something unusual. Executions weren't done one by one in isolation. They were done in batches. A group would be brought in, executed within seconds, and then removed. Immediately after, the next group would be brought forward. This cycle could continue for hours, especially during peak periods when arrests were high. There was no ceremony, no waiting, and no emotional pause. The entire process was treated like a task that needed to be completed efficiently. By 1981, this system was under even more pressure. After major political clashes, especially involving opposition groups like the Mujahideen-ul-Khalq (MEK), thousands of new prisoners were added to the system. The firing squad method allowed authorities to keep up with this growing number without slowing down the pace of executions. But even with this level of organization, firing squads had their limits. They required multiple shooters, coordination, ammunition, and space for each execution round. As the number of prisoners kept rising, it became clear that another method was needed. So, hanging started to appear more frequently as an execution method. At first, it was used alongside firing squads, not as a replacement, but it quickly showed clear advantages when dealing with larger numbers of prisoners. Inside facilities like Evin and Gohardasht, authorities began setting up fixed gallows in controlled areas such as storage rooms, basements, or enclosed courtyards where executions could happen without interruption or outside visibility. The process itself was simple but harsh. Prisoners were brought in one at a time or in short lines. A rope was placed around the neck, and once everything was set, the platform beneath them was removed or dropped. Death usually took a few minutes, but the time it took made the moment more drawn out compared to gunfire. This had a psychological effect on other prisoners nearby, especially those who could hear or partially see what was happening. One of the main reasons hanging became more common was because it needed fewer people. Unlike firing squads, which required a team of shooters and coordination, hanging could be carried out by just a few guards. This made it easier to continue the process for long periods without exhausting resources and personnel. Another major advantage was the ability to scale it up. Multiple ropes could be set up side by side, allowing several prisoners to be executed at the same time. Once one group was finished, bodies were removed quickly, and the next group was brought in. This created a steady flow that didn't depend on reloading weapons or resetting positions like firing squads did. The quieter nature of hanging also mattered. Gunshots could be heard across prison grounds and even outside in some cases, which made it harder to hide what was happening. Hanging, on the other hand, produced far less noise. This helped authorities keep the process more contained and reduce the chance of outside attention. Over time, hanging proved to be more practical for handling large numbers in a controlled environment. But while executions inside prisons were becoming more organized, authorities used public executions as a separate tool to control the wider population. These were carefully planned moments where the government wanted to show its power openly and send a clear message to everyone watching. Hanging was the most common method used in public too, because it could be set up almost anywhere. Cranes, construction equipment, or temporary gallows were brought into public spaces like city squares, busy intersections, or open areas where people naturally gathered. Locations were chosen to maximize visibility so that as many people as possible would witness what was happening. Some people were forced to attend, especially in certain areas, while others came because they'd heard about the execution and wanted to see it for themselves. The condemned person was usually brought out with their hands tied, sometimes after being publicly identified as someone who had committed a serious crime or acted against the state. This labeling was important because it framed the execution as justified in the eyes of those watching. The execution itself was carried out quickly, but the impact stayed much longer. There were often no long speeches or announcements. The act happened in silence or near silence, which made it even more intense. Everyone present understood what they were seeing without needing it to be explained. These public executions turned fear into something physical and immediate. It was no longer just about stories from inside prisons. It was something happening in everyday places, in front of ordinary people going about their lives. This changed behavior across society. People became more careful about what they said, who they trusted, and how they acted. But even this visible display had limits. By the early 1980s, prisons across Iran were no longer dealing with small numbers of detainees. After repeated crackdowns on political groups, thousands of prisoners were being held at the same time in places like Evin prison in Tehran and Gohardasht prison near Karaj. Under the authority of Ruhollah Khomeini, the system had to change from fast but chaotic executions into something that could handle large numbers without slowing down. That's when the process started to look more like a fixed routine rather than isolated events. Inside these prisons, movement was controlled step by step. Prisoners were often taken from crowded cells and moved through a sequence of rooms. First came identification, where guards confirmed names and files. Then came a short round of questioning, sometimes handled by officials connected to the revolutionary courts that had been shaped earlier by figures like Sadek Kalkali. These questions were not detailed investigations. They were quick checks, often focused on loyalty, past activity, or suspected connections. Once a decision was made, there was no delay. Those selected for execution were immediately separated from the rest. There was no waiting list, no scheduling for another day. The system was designed to move fast, so the flow never stopped. Guards escorted prisoners directly toward the execution area, which was already prepared in advance. In the case of hanging, ropes were fixed ahead of time in rooms or enclosed courtyards. Prisoners were brought in groups, sometimes still blindfolded from earlier movement, and positioned one after another. The executions were carried out in quick succession, with no pause between individuals. As soon as one group was finished, the bodies were taken down and moved away, and the next group was brought in. For firing squads, the setup was just as organized. Shooters were already in position before the prisoners arrived. Once a group was lined up, the execution happened within seconds. Afterwards, the area was cleared quickly so the next group could be brought in without delay. This constant rotation allowed executions to continue for long hours, sometimes through the night. Bodies were removed immediately after each execution. They were often taken to unknown locations for burial, sometimes in mass graves, without identification. Families were almost never informed in advance, and in many cases, they only learned about the death much later, if at all. In 1988, this organized system reached its most intense phase. After years of war and internal tension, the government carried out one of the largest waves of executions in modern Iranian history. Hanging became the main method during this period. Inside prisons like Evin and Gohardasht, special areas were prepared specifically for this purpose. Multiple ropes were fixed in advance, often side by side, allowing several prisoners to be executed at the same time. The process was built for speed. Prisoners were brought in groups, sometimes directly from their cells, after very brief questioning sessions that decided their fate in minutes. Once a group entered the execution area, everything moved quickly. The ropes were placed, the platforms were removed, and within a short time, the process was complete. This cycle continued daily, over and over again. The repetition was constant, and the system did not stop, unless there were no more prisoners scheduled for that round. In many cases, prisoners were executed within minutes of being selected. There was no time to understand what was happening, no chance to prepare, and no outside communication. Everything was contained within the prison walls. Unlike the early years of the revolution, these executions were not shown publicly. There were no announcements, no media coverage, and no visible signs outside. The entire operation was kept quiet. Families were not told, and in many cases they only realized something had happened when visits suddenly stopped. Alongside these organized mass executions, there was another pattern that created even deeper fear, where people simply disappeared. Not every execution followed a visible or recorded process. Some prisoners were taken from their cells and never seen again without any official explanation. These removals often happened quietly. A name would be called, the prisoner would leave with guards, and that would be the last time anyone inside the prison saw them. No public records, no announcements, no confirmation of what method was used. However, based on patterns inside these facilities, many were believed to have been executed either by hanging or by firing squad in isolated areas. What made this especially disturbing was the complete lack of information. Families waiting outside had no way of knowing what had happened. They weren't told about executions, not given bodies, and not informed of burial sites. In many cases, they continued to wait for visits that would never happen. Graves were often unmarked or hidden. Some burial sites were later believed to be mass graves, but without clear identification. This erased the final trace of the person, making it impossible for families to find closure. This kind of disappearance created a different kind of fear compared to public executions. It wasn't about witnessing death. It was about uncertainty. People didn't just fear being executed. They feared being removed from existence without any record, without any acknowledgement. That uncertainty stayed with families for years. By the final years of Khomeini's rule, especially leading up to 1989, the execution system had become fully structured and controlled. There was no longer any randomness in how it operated. Every method had a clear role, and each was used depending on the situation. Firing squads were still used when an immediate execution was required, especially in cases where speed was the priority and the number of prisoners was smaller. Hanging remained the preferred method when dealing with larger groups because it allowed multiple executions to happen at the same time with fewer people involved. Public executions continued to be used when authorities wanted to send a direct and visible message to the population. At the same time, silent executions and disappearances were used when attention needed to be avoided. This allowed the system to continue operating without drawing outside focus, especially during periods when secrecy was important. Each method was part of a larger system. Nothing was accidental. The choice or method depended on the goal.